Hey YouTube, how you doing? It's Max. So this video is going to be about showing versus telling, the common writing rule. Coincidentally, there's a YouTube channel named Hello Future Me that also does a video on this topic that was recently came out. And overall, I think he does a much better job explaining this on an intellectual level. So if you're interested in, really well produced videos, then I would go check him out. I put the link in the description. I think we have like a similar conclusive idea about show don't tell as a concept, but my thoughts are going to be more like opinions and stuff, and his is more like video essay, high quality kind of stuff. So go check it out. Anyways, I'm gonna get into it. So show don't tell is a very common concept, popular concept that I think we learn it in about like fifth or sixth grade here in the United States. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I just think that it's oversimplified and it deserves some critique and questioning and just thinking a little bit more profoundly about the concept. So yeah, it's like this golden rule, and intuitively it makes sense. Like show don't tell. I like when you think of like really good like works or really good scenes, it's like, oh, look at how they showed that scene. Like when you watch a movie and they're able to do a complete scene without any dialogue whatsoever, you're like, man, that's a great scene. And I think that's really good for like at like that high level of writing for a final product. I think it's good to help teach writing, but I don't think that it should be this golden rule that you constantly have like weighing on you like pressure the entire time you're writing. So I guess like why is this even a rule then? I think the goal of this rule is really like for new writers when let's say you're in like third or fourth grade and you're using words all the time like very or tall, really simple kind of sentences that are just kind of boring with boring words. Um, I think that it's especially good for like kind of coaching you out of that mindset. But unfortunately, I think that like utilizing showing takes a lot of tact. And I think just simply saying show don't tell doesn't really teach you how to use like how to write with tact. It just kind of is, a vague thing to tell you not to do vague things. Um, so yeah, I don't think it communicates enough information. I think it's difficult, and I think it's a trap. And it's sort of like Goldilocks. How I think that if you don't show enough, then you run the risk of being like too cliche or unoriginal. And if you show too much, then you run the risk of being too confusing and too convoluted and vague in your writing. So I think that in order to accurately do showing, you got to be like Goldilocks's thing and just hit it just right. Um, so like for example, cliche showing. An example would be like it felt like there were butterflies in the pit of her stomach, and this obviously means that like she was probably like nervous or something. Um, and when you think about like the butterflies in the pit of her stomach, you've heard this phrase so many times that you lose the meaning. I think what it's trying to evoke is this feeling of like riding a roller coaster and you're getting all nervous, and there's this excitement but also this fear, and that's kind of like this butterflies effect, but it doesn't really have that result. And so it's overused and it loses that sense of imagery that you're trying to convey. And that's if you're not showing it enough. If you're showing it too much, then for example, I've seen this before in like character descriptions or descriptions of like setting, where like have you ever seen those like character descriptions where it's just paragraphs of the character, and it's like, why do I need to know all this information about the character that I just met, or like the scene, and you're like going into like all this detail about like all the different plants and animals, and then like you see the scene and it has nothing to do with half of the descriptions that were listed in the description of the setting, and maybe they're used like way down the road, but you don't need to evoke. You can kind of do this over time. You don't have to do it all at once. I just need to know if I'm in a forest or in a meadow, or if I'm in a building, or if I just need to know where I am, and then from there I can kind of like learn more about the thing or about the place or the person as I go. And this is kind of similar to like in video games, if you've ever done like video game design, where the tutorials, what's a bad tutorial? When they kind of overload the tutorial with so much information. What's better than just a tutorial? Just kind of learning as you go. So level one, you learn one skill, and that skill is kind of built upon throughout that level, and then you get the test at the boss. And that's kind of like how I think chapters should be kind of thought of as. It's like, what's this central point, what's this central skill, similar to learning a video game, that I need to know by the end of the chapter, and then you kind of learn it and it's reinforced by the end of the chapter. Sorry if that's kind of getting a little bit off topic, but I think that just kind of like helps explain how if you put too much showing into it, it can just be confusing and boring. And like a tutorial, you just kind of disengage from the actual, what's going on. Um, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about why I think it's okay to tell, and I kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think that telling is a good way to reinforce ideas for the audience. Like if you've ever seen like a show or a movie and it just says like the year at the bottom, that's a quick way to like clarify for the audience that it's taking place in this year. Or it says like, Victoria, England, you're in England. You don't have to even question it. And there isn't really a purpose to show it. You could show it, but are you really doing any benefit taking that time to potentially have that misunderstanding? I think it's just, if it's something that's pretty critical, you might as well just show it, and you just do it in a way that's so quick that before the audience even has time to even really consider it, they're just, already sold, yep, that we're in Victoria, England, 1858 or something like that. Overall, I think it depends on context. Like, sometimes you don't really want to, relay that information. It could be a big plot point that you don't know where you are. So, like, I think it really depends on context. I don't think that there are really rules to writing, but there are like guidelines to follow. Good ideas, but like, it really, at the end of the day, depends on the context of what you're trying to convey. And ultimately, good writing is like a you know it when you see it kind of thing. You could say that, this is bad, it's bad 100% of the time, and then someone tries to prove you wrong and they can make it really good. It's one of those things that it really, writing is very subjective. It's like art, and it's just difficult to put rules on something like that. That has, especially when it requires a sense of uniqueness and originality. I think that the bottom line is really just trying to continue to learn how to communicate ideas into words, because that's really you're pretty much playing this game with the reader of how can I convey this thought in my head into words to where they are experiencing it in a way that I am trying to get them to experience it. So, and this is all very complicated, which is why, like, show don't tell, it's catchy. These are all very complicated kind of ideas that you know it's hard to really explain this simply, if so, like, in my opinion, if there's like key information that the reader needs to know to understand the story, like plot or conflict, I think that especially in the when you're writing for the first time, writing the story down, it's more than okay to tell. And I think it's similar to like scaffolding when you're creating a you're doing construction on a building. Like, telling is basically the scaffolding of your story. So if you some people will say, like, give the audience more credit, and I think that that's fine advice too. But I think that, again, it depends on context. Anyway, I was talking about scaffolding. Like, so if there isn't any scaffolding for a building, then there isn't really any structure. And so if you show the reader like everything, like you don't tell it all, then your words are going to get lost in translation because there isn't any structure, if that makes sense. And I'm also just like this amateur writer. I've dabbled in D&D DMing for a bit. So my I'm not like any expert. I haven't written any bestsellers or anything. But just in my limited experience, there are many times where like I've been editing like stories for other writers, and or I've been playing like D&D or something, watching a movie, and there's people who miss critical information that was included in the thing, but like they just missed it because I don't know if it was just presented poorly or they weren't paying attention. But ultimately, I think that if like many people are like missing out on key information, I think that it's usually the fault of the creator, not really the audience. So as a writer, I think it's good to get in this mentality that like if people are not resonating with what I'm creating, it's good to kind of see what can I do to make it better. And usually, I think that it's more how can I make it more clear, and that kind of falls to how can I tell this better instead of try to show them. Um, and usually it's because it's too fluffy or too vague. And when I'm even going back, like if there's like a scene that I was like trying to DM and wasn't really sure what was even going on, I was just kind of like improving as you do. Or even when I'm writing, I'm kind of improving it sometimes. It's because like I'm undecided. I don't know where I'm actually going with it. And usually if I'm going in undecided, I'm like trying to be all fancy and cover it up with like big showing techniques, and I think that it ultimately backfires. So I think it's good to you know kind of tell. And there's this quote actually by Terry Pratchett, and his quote is, "The first draft is just you telling yourself the story." And I think that this is much better advice than show don't tell, because and it's kind of saying the opposite. It's not saying the first draft is you showing yourself the story. It's the first draft is you telling yourself the story. And this kind of ties back to the whole like minimum viable product thing that I've probably talked about in other videos, where you kind of want to create this prototype, this minimum viable product, the simplest form of a working product that you can. And that's usually just like a quick summary of like what's going to happen. And usually that's all telling. And once you know that the concept works, then you can always go back and improve it and make it better. But you kind of need to have that, as I was saying earlier, that scaffolding to really structure your story. And then you can show if you want, but you don't want the showing to distract from what the thing is that you're trying to explain. And so yeah, so sometimes like this whole video isn't a complete knock on showing. Sometimes showing is better, but and like sometimes, but just I guess sometimes you don't need to show in order to convey the information, especially if you can do it quickly and efficiently. I think that you should go ahead and jump on that so you can focus back on the meat of the story. And sometimes those fluffy descriptions of showing aren't really the meat. Could be, but sometimes it's not. Just overall, I guess in my like experience as a reader, as a player in D&D, or just as an audience member, if I'm watching something, I personally find it more satisfying when I know what's going on. Um, and so I think as a creator or a writer or whatever you're doing, um, kind of making sure that the the audience knows what the goal is, what the conflict is, what the stakes are. I mean, you can show those, but I think just making sure that that is being communicated clearly is more important. And because if there's any element of uncertainty that the audience might be having on what's actually going on, then it doesn't really matter how much you're showing. It can just backfire, and you run the risk of losing your audience's attention, and that's worse than telling, in my opinion. I don't know if this is a good analogy, but I was thinking about it. It's kind of like when you're cooking and you don't want to over salt your food, and I feel like showing is kind of like salting your food, and you kind of want just enough salt. You don't want to over salt your food because then your food becomes inedible. And if you don't show at all, or if you don't salt at all, then your food can be kind of bland. So I think it's just kind of like one of those things where you kind of learn with experience. It's not so cookie cutter. Show don't tell. I think it's just you know too vague. So yeah, overall, uh, showing isn't bad. Showing is just difficult because it requires a lot of tact, and it can easily be done wrong. Overall, I don't think telling is bad either. I think telling can be useful, especially if you're drafting up your story. And I think that it just gets a bad misconception of like, oh, you're being lazy, you're not showing. I think that it can be effective, just as effective as showing in the right context. And my main point is that don't tell. I've probably said this a million times. Show don't tell is just vague advice that people use to create vague stories. I think that the ultimate takeaway is that there isn't really a simple golden rule to writing. I don't think that show don't tell is the golden rule that we should hold up to a high, like, this is what a good story is. I think that it just depends on context. It depends on you choosing the correct method of communication, and I think that you should just be deliberate in what kind of story that you want to tell and how you want to, set that up. I don't think that you should follow show because someone told you that you have to show, don't tell. I think that you should just figure out what the idea is in your head and how you can deliberately communicate that to the audience. In whatever way you think is best. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I just think that there's a lot of pressure on writing, and it kind of creates this, you know, with writer's block, and like, how can I do this better? I think really just if I could give any advice with my limited experience, it's just put it down on the page uh, in the most simple way as possible you can. So that would say telling. Just tell yourself the story as Terry Pratchett said, and then as you kind of build upon those drafts, you can show it if you want to. You don't have to. Whatever you think is going to make it better, but without trying to overcomplicate it. Um, and then yeah, because if it's overcomplicated, then people are gonna not connect. If it's they're not connecting, they're not gonna consume the content. Then what are you doing it for? But yeah, if I could redefine the rule, it would probably be something along the lines of be more deliberate or be more explicit in your writing rather than being vague or flashy. You don't need to flex with showing. You just need to make it digestible. Anyways, that's all I really got. Again, if you want a more sophisticated person explaining this, go check out the Hello Future Me video in the description. But yeah, have a good one later days.